The entire emergency room went silent the moment the CEO's hand cracked across the rookie nurse's face. "Get out, bitch," he snapped coldly. "This hospital isn't a charity." Emma didn't argue, didn't even raise her voice. She simply stood there in her light blue scrubs, cheek burning, while security took her badge and shoved her toward the exit. Behind her, the elderly man she had just stitched up struggled to sit upright on the hospital bed. "You fired her for helping me?" he asked quietly. The CEO scoffed. "She treated you without payment. That nurse broke hospital protocol." The old man studied Emma for a long moment, then slowly reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. "Understood," he said calmly into the receiver. 10 minutes later, the thunder of rotor blades shook the entire hospital building. A U.S. Navy helicopter descended into the front parking lot, scattering doctors and nurses toward the windows. The door slid open. A Navy SEAL commander stepped out, walking straight through the ER entrance. He scanned the room once, then asked in a voice that made the entire hospital freeze, "Where is the nurse who treated my veteran?" Before we begin, comment where you're watching from and subscribe if you believe real heroes often go unnoticed. Because that afternoon, a hospital realized they had just fired the wrong nurse. The emergency room at St. Gabriel Medical Center was loud even on calm days. But that afternoon, the air carried a different kind of tension. Rain hammered the glass doors at the entrance, soaking the pavement outside while stretchers rolled in and out beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Emma Carter moved quickly between beds in her light blue scrubs, tying back her blonde hair as she checked monitors and adjusted IV lines. She was still new here, the rookie nurse who volunteered for the shifts nobody else wanted. The late nights, the messy cases, the patients who couldn't afford the kind of care St. Gabriel preferred to offer only after paperwork was complete. Some of the senior nurses thought she worked too hard for someone who'd only been there a few months. Others whispered that she had a habit of ignoring rules when a patient needed help. Emma never argued with them. She simply did her job, moving quietly from one bed to the next with the calm focus of someone who had seen worse places than a crowded emergency room. That afternoon seemed ordinary until the security guard near the entrance suddenly shouted for assistance. Through the sliding glass doors, a figure collapsed onto the wet pavement outside the hospital. A thin, elderly man in a worn military jacket had fallen hard against the concrete steps, one hand pressed against his head as blood ran down the side of his face. The security guard hesitated. Hospital policy required registration before treatment unless a physician declared the situation life-threatening. The man had no paperwork, no insurance card, no identification ready. Emma didn't wait for a supervisor to decide. She pushed the doors open into the rain and knelt beside him, her voice steady as she checked his pulse. The cut above his eyebrow was deep, the bleeding steady, and his breathing was uneven. "Sir, stay with me," she said softly, helping him sit upright. The security guard tried to stop her. "We can't bring him in without intake," he warned. Emma barely looked up. "Then call intake while I stop the bleeding." Within seconds, she had her arm under the man's shoulder and was guiding him inside, rainwater dripping from her sleeves as she pushed a wheelchair toward the nearest trauma bay. Inside the ER, a few nurses exchanged worried glances. Everyone knew the hospital's rules: no admission without billing authorization unless the attending physician signed off first. Emma didn't slow down long enough to think about the consequences. She cleaned the wound with practiced hands, stitched the laceration above the man's eye, and checked for signs of concussion. The old man never complained. He just watched her quietly while she worked, his gray eyes alert, despite the blood running down his cheek. "You're lucky," Emma told him gently while finishing the last stitch. "Another inch and you'd have needed surgery." He gave a faint smile. "Lucky to land near a nurse who doesn't ask questions." Emma shrugged, placing a bandage over the wound. "You were bleeding. That's enough reason." Around them, the ER hummed with the usual noise of medical equipment and distant voices. For a moment, the small treatment area felt strangely calm. Then the doors slammed open again, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The hospital's CEO strode into the emergency ward like a storm breaking through a window. Tall, expensive suit, sharp voice already echoing across the room before anyone could stop him. "Who authorized treatment for the man in bed 3? He demanded, his eyes scanning the staff like a searchlight. Nurses stepped back from their stations. A doctor cleared his throat but said nothing. Emma looked up from the chart she had just begun filling out and stepped forward. "I did," she said simply. The CEO stared at her as if she had just confessed to something criminal. "And who are you?" he asked. "Emma Carter, registered nurse." His lip curled slightly. The rookie. He glanced at the chart in her hands and then at the patient. There's no billing authorization, no intake file, no insurance record. Emma kept her voice level. He was bleeding. I stabilized him. The CEO's patient snapped instantly. That's not your decision to make. The room grew quiet enough that the beeping of a nearby heart monitor sounded loud. Staff members watched from behind their stations, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. The CEO stepped closer to Emma, his voice rising with every word. This hospital runs on procedure, not your personal charity project. Emma didn't move. He needed help, she replied quietly. That's what hospitals are for.
A few nurses shifted uncomfortably. The CEO's face darkened. You think you're some kind of hero? He asked. Emma said nothing. The silence seemed to provoke him even more. People like you are a liability, he continued sharply. You break protocol, you risk lawsuits, and you embarrass this institution. He pointed toward the exit. You're done here. Emma barely had time to react before the CEO's hand lashed out. The slap echoed across the emergency room like a gunshot. Conversation stopped instantly. The security guards near the entrance froze where they stood. Emma's head turned slightly from the impact, but she didn't raise her voice or step back. Her cheek flushed red beneath the bright hospital lights. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of fluorescent bulbs overhead. The CEO looked almost satisfied with the silence he had created. Get out, bitch, he said coldly. You're fired. The words hung in the air long after he finished speaking. Two security guards approached awkwardly, unsure whether they were escorting a criminal or a colleague. Emma removed her ID badge without protest and handed it to one of them. She glanced once toward the patient she had treated. The elderly man had pushed himself upright on the hospital bed, watching the entire scene with a calm expression that didn't match the chaos around him. Emma walked toward him before leaving. Your stitches should hold, she said quietly. Try to rest for a few hours. The man studied her face for a long moment. You helped me when no one else would, he said. Emma gave a small, tired smile. That's the job. Then she turned and walked toward the exit doors, security following a few steps behind. The ER slowly returned to motion after she left, but the tension remained thick in the air. Staff avoided the CEO's gaze as he straightened his jacket and ordered someone to discharge the patient immediately. The elderly man swung his legs off the bed and stood carefully. His posture was steadier than before, and the faint smile returned to his face. You shouldn't have fired that nurse, he said calmly. The CEO scoffed. She broke protocol for a man who can't even pay his bill. The old man reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a phone. His fingers dialed a number with quiet precision. Yes, he said into the receiver after a moment. It's Chief Davis. The CEO rolled his eyes and turned away, already dismissing the conversation as irrelevant. The veteran's voice remained calm. The medic is here, he continued quietly. And they just fired her. Outside the hospital, Emma stepped into the rain, the cold wind brushing across her face where the slap had landed. The sky above the parking lot was gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over the city like a storm waiting to break. She paused under the small awning near the employee entrance, unsure where she would go next. Losing the job didn't hurt as much as she expected. What lingered instead was the familiar weight of quiet disappointment. The same feeling she had known years earlier, when systems meant to save lives chose rules over people. She reached into her bag and touched a small metal object hidden inside, something she carried but rarely looked at anymore. Then she closed the bag again and started walking toward the street. Behind her, the hospital door slid open, and the elderly veteran stepped outside, watching her disappear down the sidewalk. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked up toward the dark sky above the parking lot. 10 minutes later, the quiet afternoon shattered as the thunder of rotor blades tore across the hospital grounds, and the staff inside St. Gabriel rushed to the windows, just as a massive Navy helicopter descended toward the parking lot, because someone important had just arrived, looking for the nurse they had fired. The thunder of rotor blades swallowed the sound of the rain as the Navy helicopter descended toward the hospital parking lot, scattering loose papers and gravel across the asphalt. Nurses and patients crowded against the lobby windows, staring as the massive aircraft settled onto the pavement, where staff usually parked their cars. The wind from the rotor wash rattled the glass doors and bent the nearby trees sideways. Inside the ER, the CEO stepped toward the windows with visible irritation, clearly assuming this was some kind of medical evacuation mistake. Hospitals occasionally received helicopter transfers, but never like this. Never with a full military aircraft landing directly in the main lot without warning. The moment the helicopter touched down, its side doors slid open and 2 uniformed sailors jumped onto the wet pavement. Then a third figure stepped out behind them. He wore a dark tactical jacket over a Navy uniform, his posture calm and controlled, despite the chaos swirling around him.
Even from inside the hospital, it was obvious he carried authority, and as he began walking toward the entrance, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. The automatic doors opened before anyone inside could react. The Navy officer entered with the quiet confidence of someone used to walking into unfamiliar territory without asking permission. Rainwater dripped from his boots onto the polished hospital floor as he scanned the room once, quickly and methodically, taking in the faces around him. The sailors who followed him remained near the doorway, their eyes alert as if expecting trouble. The CEO stepped forward immediately, his irritation returning now that the spectacle had an audience. "You can't just land a military helicopter on private property," he said sharply. "Who authorized this?" The officer didn't answer right away. His gaze moved across the emergency ward, past the nurses pretending to check charts, and the doctors standing awkwardly beside their desks. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying through the room with surprising weight. "Where is the nurse who treated my veteran?" The question seemed simple, yet the silence that followed it felt enormous. The CEO blinked, clearly confused by the wording. "Your veteran," he repeated, almost scoffing. One of the nurses glanced toward the hallway where Emma had walked out minutes earlier. Another shifted uncomfortably, suddenly remembering the slap that had echoed across the room not long ago. The officer's eyes moved slowly between them, reading the tension that nobody had spoken out loud. "An elderly man was treated here about 20 minutes ago," he continued. "Head injury, stitches above the right eye."
Several staff members exchanged uneasy looks. The CEO waved his hand dismissively. "That patient is being discharged," he said. "He didn't have insurance." The officer studied him for a moment, the expression on his face neither angry nor surprised. "I'm not asking about his insurance," he replied quietly. "I'm asking about the nurse who helped him." A murmur rippled through the room. Somewhere behind the front desk, someone whispered Emma's name under their breath. At that moment, the sliding doors opened again, and the elderly veteran stepped inside from the rain. His jacket was still damp, the bandage above his eyebrow clean and neatly stitched. The moment the Navy officer saw him, his posture changed slightly, as if acknowledging someone important. "Chief Davis," he said, offering a small nod. The old man returned it with a faint smile. "Commander," he replied. The exchange happened so naturally that most of the hospital staff didn't even realize what it meant. The CEO, however, suddenly looked far less confident than he had a few seconds earlier. "You know each other?" he asked cautiously. The veteran glanced toward the hallway where Emma had disappeared. "That nurse," he said calmly, "stitched me up when your staff wanted to leave me bleeding on the sidewalk." The officer's eyes darkened slightly at that. "Where is she now?" he asked again. The room fell silent in a way that made several nurses lower their eyes. The CEO shifted his weight, trying to regain control of the situation. "She no longer works here," he said bluntly. "She violated hospital protocol." The words sounded far less impressive with two Navy sailors standing behind the officer near the door. The veteran chuckled softly, shaking his head as if he had expected exactly that answer. "Protocol," he repeated quietly. "That nurse stopped my bleeding before your administrators finished arguing about paperwork." The officer's gaze returned to the CEO. "You fired her," he said. It wasn't a question. The CEO stiffened. "She treated a patient without authorization," he replied defensively. "That's not how this hospital operates." The officer studied him for a long moment, then slowly looked around the emergency room again. The tension in the air had shifted. Even the doctors who usually avoided confrontation seemed to sense that something about this conversation was going very wrong. Outside, the helicopter blades continued turning, their steady rhythm echoing faintly through the hospital walls. A young nurse near the reception desk whispered to her colleague, "Why would the Navy send a helicopter for one patient?" No one answered her. The veteran leaned casually against the counter, watching the exchange unfold with quiet amusement. "Commander," he said, glancing toward the doors again, "the medic is already gone." That word made the officer pause. He turned his head slightly. "Medic?" The veteran nodded. "You didn't recognize her?" he asked.
The officer frowned for a moment, replaying something in his mind. "Blonde nose," the veteran continued. "Light blue scrubs, steady hands." A strange look crossed the officer's face. For a brief second, he seemed to be remembering something he couldn't quite place. "She worked fast," the veteran added quietly. "Too fast for someone fresh out of nursing school." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as that detail settled in. The CEO folded his arms impatiently, clearly irritated that the conversation had drifted away from him. "Look," he said sharply, "whatever military business you have with that patient is none of our concern. The nurse broke hospital policy and she's gone." The officer finally turned back toward him, the calm in his expression now carrying a subtle edge. "And you're certain she's gone?" he asked. The CEO nodded firmly. "Security escorted her out 10 minutes ago." A few nurses shifted uncomfortably again. The officer glanced toward the glass doors, where the rain continued falling outside. For a moment, he seemed to be calculating something. Then he turned to the veteran. "Chief," he said quietly, "did you catch her name?" The old man smiled faintly. "Emma," he replied. The officer repeated the name under his breath, almost thoughtfully, as if testing how it sounded. Before anyone could speak again, the officer took a few steps toward the doors, his eyes fixed on the rain-soaked parking lot outside. Something about the name had triggered a memory he couldn't ignore. He stopped just short of the entrance, then slowly turned back toward the veteran. "Did she say where she was going?" he asked. The veteran shook his head, just that she was doing her job. The officer nodded once, then looked toward the nurses gathered near the desk. "Which direction did she leave?" he asked. One of them hesitated before pointing toward the street. The officer didn't waste another second. He walked back toward the entrance, signaling quietly to the sailors behind him. As the door slid open and the rain blew inside, the hospital staff watched him step back into the storm, scanning the sidewalk as if searching for someone who had already disappeared. Inside the ER, the silence lingered long after he left.
The CEO tried to laugh it off, though the sound came out forced. "Ridiculous," he muttered, turning away from the window. But the veteran remained standing at the counter, watching the officer outside with knowing eyes. Then he said something that made the room go quiet again. "You should never judge someone by their scrubs," he murmured. The CEO scoffed, pretending not to care. But several nurses looked toward the rain-covered street where Emmer had walked away only minutes earlier, because something about that Navy commander reacted to her name made it clear this story wasn't finished yet. And before the helicopter lifted off again, the commander was already scanning the street for Emma, because he had just started to realize the nurse they fired might not be just a nurse after all. If you believe people should never be judged by their job title or appearance, comment "Never Judge" below, because the next thing that commander was about to discover would make the entire hospital regret what happened inside that ER. Rain continued to fall in steady sheets across the hospital parking lot as the Navy commander stepped outside, the sound of the helicopter blades still rumbling overhead like distant thunder. The rotor wash whipped his jacket against his shoulders, while the two sailors behind him scanned the sidewalk leading toward the street. The commander's eyes moved slowly across the empty pavement, where the nurse had walked only minutes earlier. Something about the veteran's words kept repeating in his mind. She worked too fast. In hospitals, speed meant experience, and the way Chief Davis had described the treatment didn't sound like the work of a rookie nurse learning on the job. It sounded like the kind of field stabilization he had seen only from trained combat medics. The commander took a few steps toward the edge of the lot, rain striking his face as he studied the nearby intersection. For a moment, he almost convinced himself it was coincidence. Then the name echoed again in his thoughts, Emma, and a memory surfaced that made him stop cold. Inside the hospital lobby, the staff had gathered near the windows again, watching the scene unfold through the rain-streaked glass. The CEO stood among them, trying to maintain the same confidence he'd shown earlier, though his expression had tightened noticeably. The old veteran leaned quietly against the counter, arms folded as if he had already seen how this story would end.
"He's looking for her," one of the nurses whispered. "Why would a Navy officer care about a nurse?" another murmured.
The veteran answered without looking away from the parking lot. "Because sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who've seen the most." The comment seemed to linger in the air. A young doctor frowned slightly, replaying the moment Emma had stitched the wound in his mind. She had worked with unsettling precision, clean, quick, efficient, almost like someone who had done it under far worse conditions than a hospital emergency room. Outside, the commander reached the sidewalk just as a gust of wind sent rain sweeping across the street. The traffic light at the corner flickered through red and green reflections on the wet asphalt. Then he saw her. Emma was halfway down the block, walking slowly beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, her hospital bag slung over one shoulder. She hadn't looked back once since leaving the building. The commander paused for a second before stepping forward. Something about her posture was familiar in a way he couldn't quite explain. Even through the rain, she walked with the steady balance of someone used to carrying equipment and moving through rough terrain. It wasn't the posture of a civilian nurse rushing home after a bad shift. It was the quiet, deliberate stride of someone trained to stay calm when the world around them fell apart. The commander quickened his pace. Emma heard the footsteps behind her before she turned around. Years of instinct had taught her to notice small sounds, even in the middle of noise. She stopped beneath the streetlight and looked over her shoulder. The Navy officer approached through the rain, his expression serious but not aggressive.
For a moment, neither of them spoke. The helicopter's distant blades hummed behind him like a low mechanical heartbeat. "Emma Carter?" he asked finally. She studied him carefully before nodding. "That's me." Her voice carried the calm exhaustion of someone who had just lost a job but was too tired to argue about it. The commander stopped a few feet away, rain dripping from the brim of his jacket. "You treated Chief Davis inside that hospital," he said. Emma shrugged slightly. "He needed stitches." The commander watched her hands for a moment. They were steady, even in the cold rain. "You stabilized him in under 5 minutes," he continued. "Most nurses take 15. Emma gave a faint half-smile. "Guess I work fast." Back inside the hospital lobby, several staff members had moved closer to the glass doors, trying to see what was happening through the rain. The veteran stood quietly among them, clearly enjoying the tension spreading through the room. "He found her," one of the nurses whispered. The CEO crossed his arms, pretending the entire situation was an inconvenience rather than something spiraling out of control. "If he's here about that patient, it's already handled," he muttered. But the veteran shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "He's not here for the patient." The CEO frowned. "Then what?" The veteran's eyes never left the parking lot. "He's here for the medic." Out on the sidewalk, the commander tilted his head slightly as he studied Emma's face. "Where did you learn trauma stitching?" he asked quietly. Emma hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Nursing school," she replied. The answer sounded rehearsed, like something she had said many times before. The commander didn't react immediately. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small waterproof tablet used by military personnel for field records. He tapped the screen once, scrolling through a list that seemed to contain hundreds of names. Emma watched him carefully now. The rain continued falling around them, the streetlight casting pale reflections across the wet pavement.
Finally, the commander stopped scrolling. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read something on the screen. "Emma Carter," he repeated slowly. "Former petty officer, United States Navy." Emma's expression didn't change, but her silence said enough. The commander looked up from the tablet. "Combat medic," he continued, "attached to a reconnaissance unit operating overseas 3 years ago." Emma closed her eyes briefly, the rain dripping down her hair. She had hoped the past would stay buried where she left it. "That file should be sealed," she said quietly. The commander nodded once. "It is." He studied her again, the pieces finally beginning to fall into place. The veteran's call, the speed of the medical work, the steady hands. "Your unit was involved in an ambush during an extraction mission," he said carefully. Emma's jaw tightened slightly. "You've read enough," she replied. But the commander continued anyway. "You were the only medic assigned to the team." Emma looked down at the pavement. The rain masked the expression on her face, but the tension in her shoulders told the story clearly enough. Back inside the hospital, the veteran stepped away from the window and looked toward the CEO. "You slapped a Navy combat medic," he said calmly. The CEO scoffed. "She's a nurse who broke hospital policy." The veteran smiled faintly. "You still don't understand, do you?" The doctors nearby exchanged uncertain glances. One of them leaned toward the veteran. "What are you talking about?" he asked quietly. The old man gestured toward the street, where the commander and Emma stood talking under the rain. "That nurse you fired," he said softly, "used to keep entire SEAL teams alive in places where hospitals didn't exist." On the sidewalk, the commander's voice lowered slightly. "Your squad was hit during a communications failure," he said. "Extraction delayed. Heavy casualties." Emma's hands tightened around the strap of her bag. She didn't answer. The commander watched her carefully.
You stabilize 3 wounded operators with nothing but a field kit, he continued. 9 hours under fire. Emma finally looked up at him, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. You weren't there, she said quietly. The commander nodded. No, he admitted. But I know someone who was. Emma frowned slightly. The commander gestured toward the hospital behind him. Chief Davis, he said. He was part of the unit that requested your extraction that day. The words seemed to stop the rain itself for a moment. Emma stared at him, stunned by the connection she hadn't realized. Inside the hospital, the veteran watched through the window, knowing exactly what realization had just landed. The commander continued speaking, his voice calm but filled with quiet respect. He recognized you the moment you stitched that wound, he said. Emma shook her head slowly. I left that life behind, she whispered. The commander's gaze softened slightly. Maybe, he replied, but it clearly didn't leave you. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The rain drummed softly against the pavement, and the helicopter's rotors continued spinning in the background. Then the commander turned toward the hospital building, his expression changing in a way that made Emma glance up. The calm professionalism in his eyes had shifted into something colder. So, he said quietly, the CEO fired you for helping a veteran. Emma gave a tired shrug. That's how the system works. The commander looked back toward the ER windows, where several hospital staff members were still watching. Then he said something that made Emma freeze in place. Good, he said calmly, because I think it's time that hospital understands exactly who they just threw out. And with that, the Navy commander turned and started walking back toward the emergency room doors, leaving Emma standing in the rain as she realized the confrontation inside the hospital was only just beginning. The rain continued to fall as the Navy commander walked back toward the hospital entrance, his boots splashing through shallow puddles across the parking lot. Behind him, the helicopter's blades were still turning slowly, the low rhythmic thump echoing across the building like a distant drum.
Emma remained standing under the streetlight for a moment, watching him go. Something in his expression had changed when he turned toward the hospital, something colder and far more deliberate. She had seen that look before, years ago, in places where authority walked into rooms and quietly rearranged the balance of power without raising its voice. For a second, she considered simply walking away. She had already lost the job, already decided that St. Gabriel was just another system, more concerned with paperwork than people. But instinct made her follow at a distance, her footsteps slow against the wet pavement, as the commander pushed through the glass doors and stepped back into the hospital lobby. Inside, the atmosphere had grown tense enough that even the faint hum of medical equipment seemed louder than usual. Doctors stood near their stations, pretending to work while secretly watching the entrance. Nurses gathered near the reception desk, whispering quietly among themselves. When the commander walked in, the conversation stopped instantly. The 2 sailors who had remained near the doorway straightened slightly, their presence a silent reminder that the helicopter outside hadn't been some kind of mistake. The CEO stepped forward again, irritation returning now that he saw the officer had come back without the nurse. I thought I made myself clear, he said sharply. Your patient has been discharged and the employee responsible is no longer here. The commander looked at him calmly, rainwater still dripping from his tacket onto the polished floor. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch long enough to make several people in the room uncomfortable. Then he spoke in the same steady voice as before. You're correct, he said. She's not here. You fired her. The CEO folded his arms defensively. She violated hospital policy, he replied. We can't have staff making medical decisions outside their authority. The commander nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the explanation.
Interesting, he said, because the woman you fired has spent years making medical decisions in places where hesitation meant people died. The words drifted through the room like a sudden drop in temperature. A few nurses exchanged glances, unsure whether they had heard him correctly. The CEO scoffed dismissively. She's a nurse, he said, not a soldier. The veteran who had been standing near the counter cleared his throat softly. Actually, Chief Davis said, she used to be both. Several heads turned toward him at once. The commander stepped aside slightly, allowing the veteran to move forward. The old man looked around the ER slowly, his eyes resting on the staff who had watched Emma walk out only minutes earlier. You see that nurse as someone who broke your rules, he said calmly. The Navy saw her as the person who kept men alive when the rest of the system failed. The CEO laughed under his breath, though it sounded less confident now. you're exaggerating," he said. The commander reached into his jacket pocket and removed the small military tablet again. The glow from the screen reflected faintly across his face as he turned it toward the CEO. "Petty Officer Emma Carter," he read aloud, "United States Navy combat medic, assigned to a reconnaissance support team." The room fell completely silent. One of the doctors leaned forward slightly, trying to read the text on the screen from across the desk. The commander continued speaking. 3 years ago, her unit was caught in an ambush during a communications failure. Extraction was delayed for hours. He paused briefly, letting the weight of the story settle in the room. She treated multiple casualties with a field kit while under fire. The nurses listening near the reception desk seemed stunned by the sudden shift in the story they thought they understood. The CEO shook his head impatiently. "That has nothing to do with this hospital," he said. The commander looked up from the tablet slowly. "Actually," he replied, "it has everything to do with it." His gaze swept across the room, resting briefly on the doctors who had watched Emma work earlier that afternoon. Because the same woman who kept a wounded team alive in the desert walked into your emergency room and did exactly what she was trained to do: stabilize a bleeding patient before it was too late. A murmur passed quietly through the staff gathered nearby. Some of them remembered how quickly Emma had worked.
Others remembered the moment she had calmly ignored the security guard and pulled the injured man inside. The pieces of the story were beginning to connect in a way that made the earlier humiliation feel very different now. Chief Davis leaned against the counter again, folding his arms comfortably as he watched the CEO struggle to process the information. "When she stitched that wound," the veteran said, gesturing toward the bandage above his eyebrow, "she did it faster than most field medics I've seen." The commander nodded slightly. "That's because she's done it under worse conditions," he added. One of the younger nurses looked down at the floor, clearly remembering the moment Emma had quietly accepted the slap without arguing. The CEO's expression tightened as he realized the mood in the room had shifted away from him. "Even if that story is true," he said stubbornly, "she still violated hospital procedure." The commander studied him carefully for a second before replying. "You're right," he said calmly. "She did violate your procedure." Then he closed the tablet and slipped it back into his pocket. "She prioritized a patient's life over paperwork." The words seemed to echo in the ER. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the CEO appeared unsure how to respond. The commander stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough that the staff nearby couldn't hear him. "You slapped a combat medic," he said quietly. "A medic who walked away from the military after losing her entire team in an ambush." A few people in the room gasped softly at the detail. The commander's tone remained controlled, almost clinical. "She left that life behind because she believed helping people in a hospital would be easier than watching them die in a battlefield." His eyes shifted briefly toward the glass doors where Emma had walked out earlier. Apparently, she was wrong.
Outside, the helicopter blades continued to spin slowly in the rain, the sound drifting faintly through the hospital walls. The commander glanced toward the entrance again, before turning back to the staff gathered around him. "The Navy didn't send that helicopter here to create a scene," he continued. "It came because a retired chief petty officer called and said the medic who once saved his life had been thrown out of a hospital for doing her job." The veteran nodded quietly in agreement. Around them, several nurses looked visibly uncomfortable. A doctor near the back of the room finally spoke up. "Where is she now?" he asked. The commander gave a small shrug. "Walking away from this building," he said. For a moment, the CEO seemed ready to argue again. Then he glanced around the room and realized no one was looking at him the same way anymore. The authority he had used earlier now felt fragile in comparison to the quiet respect the commander carried without raising his voice. Chief Davis walked toward the door slowly, pausing beside the officer before stepping outside into the rain again. "Some people don't need titles to prove who they are," the veteran said softly. The commander nodded once. Through the glass doors, they could see Emma standing near the corner of the street again, unsure whether she should leave or come back. For the first time since the confrontation began, the commander allowed himself a faint smile. He stepped toward the door, pausing briefly before leaving the hospital. Behind him, the ER staff remained silent, each of them replaying the events of the afternoon with a very different understanding. Now, because the quiet rookie nurse they had watched get humiliated wasn't just another employee who broke a rule. She was someone who had spent years carrying the kind of responsibility most of them would never understand. And as the commander stepped outside to speak with her again, the entire hospital finally realized the truth they had missed all along. Sometimes the person who saves the most lives is the one who never feels the need to prove it. If this story reminded you that the quietest people often carry the strongest stories, consider subscribing. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones walking past us in ordinary scraps, simply doing the right thing when no one else.